This is a video I've really wanted to do for quite some time, but it's one that is really relevant now, particularly in Melbourne here as we get back into the racing season for our triathletes and our cyclists, covering off the basics and really making simple the process of talking about aerodynamics for cycling. Sometimes it gets really overcomplicated, and that's why a lot of people shy away from talking about it. So in this video, we're going to cover off the absolute fundamentals and talk about a few key things that you can take away to start that process of improving your aero on the bike to ultimately help you get faster. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, making sport science simple, and that's exactly what we're doing in this one, particularly for what is often looked at as a really complicated, high-level scientific process in terms of working through your cycling aerodynamics. Often you'll see professional athletes or the bike companies in particular, component companies, heading into a wind tunnel, doing lots of testing, putting the smoke trails over their athletes to have a look at all these different numbers, and there's all these different coefficients that they're talking about. Can become really overwhelming and ultimately a bit confusing for the average person. So what we're going to do today is just break down the really key parts and principles behind aerodynamics, and I might do a future video talking about how you can actually measure some of this without necessarily having some of the fancy equipment and get a bit of a rough sense of are you improving or not in terms of this department, because it definitely can make a big difference. And I see this quite a lot with particularly some really good quality amateur athletes, particularly triathletes, who can put out some really good power on the bike, but maybe they're not actually moving that quick compared to some of their competitors, and there's some performance limitations there that it may not be having to produce more power. Well, why can't we look at minimizing some of the resistances? And that's ultimately what aerodynamics is talking about. And when we're looking at cycling aerodynamics, we're talking about the interaction between what we can output versus some of the things that are holding us back. And the two real major resistive forces, if you like, that are holding us back, one is our drag force. That's everything to do with what's happening in the air. So ultimately that breaks down to things like the air density. Are we at high altitude or are we at sea level? What are the conditions like? Is there potentially any headwind, tailwind, crosswind? All of that sort of factors into it on the day, which some of that we can't control and most of that we can't control. But some of those you can, depending on your event. So you'll see at the 1 hour world records, they typically go up a little bit in altitude to try and thin the air out and make it a little bit less drag on the athlete to allow them to go as fast as possible. Includes also things like our frontal surface area, which gets talked about a lot. Basically, this is just what shape are you cutting through the air. If I'm really open and big, and you'll see this, I guess the easy comparison is when you're on your road bike sitting up on the top of the hoods versus when you're down in an aero position on a time trial bike. Naturally, you're going to be faster on the time trial bike in a straight time trial, for example, or point to point. Reason for that is because we've reduced our frontal surface area. So largely that drag force being created is just our body size. The other side of the equation is our rolling resistances, and this is everything to do with what is the interaction between us, our bike, and ultimately the road surface. So there's a number of different components that go into this. Part of it is going to be things like the mass of the rider and the bike as well. Things like gravity, are we working uphill? That's going to change some of these rolling resistances. What's the interaction between our tires and the road? Are we on a really nice, smooth, freshly laid road, or are you on something a little bit rougher that's a little bit worn? That's also going to be factored into this resistance equation. So once we add all those up, all of our drag forces and cutting through the air, if you like, or how well or not well we can cut through the air, plus also our interaction with our bike and that bike's interaction with the surface that we're on as well and our environment, all of this together compounds to give us all of our resistive forces. And ultimately we need to try and find a power output that one can overcome them, or we need to try and minimize our resistive forces so we can maintain the same power output, because that's ultimately the goal of manipulating some of these variables in terms of our cycling aerodynamics. Is first and foremost, can we produce the same amount of power and go faster? That's obviously the critical one. Ideally, we don't really want to increase power to just go faster, because that's going to give us an increased physiological cost. So what we want to do is we want to try and minimize the power ultimately, which in some cases, if we do these processes and work through some of these factors quite well, and I guess the bonus of working through some of the cycling aerodynamic stuff is that we might actually be able to minimize power, which is ultimately particularly for long distance events, long endurance type races, especially for our triathletes doing 70.3 and Ironman. It's going to allow us to come off the bike fresher because we're not working as hard, but we're going the same speed or potentially even faster. And that's the critical one, especially for an amateur athlete. Professional athletes, of course, we want to try and minimize that and play around with those variables. But for those athletes who potentially can't just increase power to overcome those resistances, or maybe minimizing that power, going the same speed, or if not slightly quicker, is actually going to turn out to be a better overall performance outcome for them. So that's really sort of how it breaks down. I guess to finish off, and we'll keep this one really short because I might do a follow-up to this talking about how you can actually measure in the field some ideas around, am I improving from an aerodynamics perspective, and get some I guess field testing data on that and do some testing yourself. What I'm going to quickly talk about is a couple of major factors that actually contribute to some of these things. So as I mentioned, it's really minimizing our drag forces and our rolling resistance. Rolling resistance is mostly to do with the componentry of the bike and your tire choice and also the weight of the bike and things like that. But I think the major one for most, particularly amateur athletes, is actually going to be more on the drag force part of it. If we can minimize some of those drag forces, as I said before, one of those big factors is just your frontal surface area, which fundamentally is just how big am I on the bike. If I can get myself down in a much more relaxed position at the front, not only is that going to maybe take some pressure off my shoulders if you get sore shoulders in aero position, for example. If I can get into a more comfortable position, I can sink into a little bit more. It'll allow me to get a little bit smaller, a little bit lower, minimize that frontal area. That's less area for the resistance to, I guess, be generated from it. It's the same thing when we talk about in the pool. If you can get that nice high body position in the water, sit towards the top of the water, there's going to be less resistance pushing against you because you're not sort of sinking down at the back. So ultimately, you're going to move through that fluid, if you like, a little bit better. Same goes for when we're cutting through air as well. If we can get a little bit smaller, doesn't mean going crazy small. It's a balance between comfort and ultimately performance here. But if we can try and reduce a little bit of that, or at least optimize a bit more, and that's where you see a lot of athletes starting to move to this high hands position. It may not actually change from the top of their head all the way down to the bottom of their bike. It might just make their arms a little bit more comfortable so they can sit in that position for longer. It might allow them to drop their head and sink their head into their, into their shoulders if they like. Drop it down. That might actually reduce that frontal area a little bit more. So bike fit and body position is really, really a critical one to sort of tick off. Secondary to that, then the big ticket items that you can really tick off, particularly as an amateur, are your helmet choice and your race suit. Reason why I go for these rather than looking at what's the most aerodynamic bike or the most aerodynamic set of wheels and things like that. The reason for that is because for the most part, most amateurs aren't actually going fast enough. And this is something that's hidden amongst all the marketing material of different bike brands is they might have the most aero bike, but if you look in the fine print, it's the most aero bike over say 45 or 46 kilometers an hour, which for the typical amateur triathlete in particular, you're probably not going anywhere near those speeds. That's definitely more that upper end professional type level. In which case, the bike isn't going to make too much of a difference. Body position is going to be number one. And then something like your race suit, if it's a bit baggy, that's obviously going to cause some drag. Baggy jersey or really baggy arms, arm sleeves, or if they're not quite sort of well fitted to you, that's where we're going to get some drag as well. The type of material in that, yes, sometimes, and I've been guilty of this before, go for the more cost-effective option. Sometimes, if you are looking for that little bit of extra performance, that slightly more expensive race suit will actually give you that little bit better performance because it might fit a little bit better, but also the materials in it might allow airflow to move over a little bit more in a little bit more smooth sort of fashion, which will ultimately help you slip through the air a little bit quicker. The other one I mentioned there is helmet choice. And this is the last one I'm going to touch on because based on what your body position is like and ultimately your frontal area, your helmet choice is then going to also potentially impact that. Reason for that, look at a lot of typical amateur triathletes. They might be riding along as they start to fatigue, they start to drop their head down. If you're wearing a really long-tailed aero helmet and as soon as you tilt your head down, that's now going to stick straight up. So that's actually increasing your frontal area. And that's one of the big mistakes a lot of amateurs make in particular is choosing the wrong helmet. So maybe if you tend to ride with your head down a bit more, maybe a shorter tail or even some of these, like the Oakley helmets these days are really rounded and they're almost circular. That might be a better option for you. Or a standard road helmet might be a better option for you than going for one of these fancy long-tailed aero helmets because it's actually going to sort of impact that a little bit as well. Apart from anything, bit of comfort. We obviously want a really comfortable helmet. So again, you can sit in that position. Ventilation's then really critical. All those factors make up the physiological performance part of it. But for the most part, we want to have a helmet that fits in with our bike fit or if our position overall on the bike. And you'll see that's where the athletes who do it really well, particularly at the amateur level, but also at the professional level. If they do have a long-tailed helmet, it's one that slips into their shoulders and there's this seamless line between the top of the head and the the back of their shoulders and going down their back, rather than having this sort of massive gap between those two, or if anything, that helmet's actually causing more trouble to us than good. So there's a little bit of a breakdown, trying to keep it really simple in terms of cycling aerodynamics. I know it can be a bit of a complex topic, and as I said earlier, we're going to do a couple of videos on this, and the next one's probably going to be touching on more what are some field test options, because there's a couple of things you can do if you just find a local velodrome to be able to test some of these principles and play around with your bike position. Obviously, ideally, go and seek some professional advice in terms of the bike fit side of things. But then having a look at some of these other aspects, looking at ways you can minimize the drag forces and manipulate your rolling resistances, is actually going to go a long way to be able to improve performance. Because at the end of the day, if we can minimize or maintain the same power output but go faster, that's going to give us a much better race result, particularly if you're an amateur. So happy to hear your comments and thoughts down below. What have you done to manipulate your aero before? Let me know in the comments. Love to have that discussion, because there's a few things I've done over the last little while that have definitely helped, and I'm absolutely a big advocate, particularly for the amateur athletes, working on some of these things, because I think it's a really easy way to get some extra speed out on the bike, particularly if you're looking at those long endurance races. Aero might be an easy way to get some of those gains and take off potentially minutes off your time as well. So hopefully you got a little bit out of this one. I'm going to leave it there, and we'll see you in the next one.